Apparently, people still buy one of these cameras. I mean, your phone shoots better video. Anyways, I hope you had a good practice and got more familiar with the three exposure controls: the ISO, aperture, and shutter speeds. In this lesson, let's not talk about my hair, which is still looking very bad, but instead let's talk about the frame rate, as there is so much more to it. In short, frame rates are the amount of frames that you record per second. Common values are 25 or 30 frames per second. In short, we talk about FPS, which stands for frames per second. Good job. Now, there are mainly three FPS values that we record in. 24 FPS, which is kind of the standard for cinema. So if you go to the movie theaters, you're probably looking at 24 FPS. It's considered more cinematic. When making videos for the web, such as YouTube, we oftentimes record in 25 or 30 FPS. And the reason that we have two different standards comes from the old days, when videos were still shown on old CRT televisions. Now, I'm not going to go in depth to what that is. It's in the past. It's behind us, but it comes down to the refresh rate of those televisions, which were bound to the frequency of the electricity. And that is different in various continents. In Europe, we have an electricity net of 50 Hz, and in the US, it's 60 Hz. I'm going to spare you all the technical stuff behind that because it's no longer making sense in the digital world. But good to know is that many cameras these days still shoot in 29.97 FPS. And that is because the electricity frequency in the US isn't actually 60 Hz, but 59 point something. That's the backstory. Now, what frame rate should you record in? Well, that is a personal taste, or what your client is asking you. Even though I'm from Europe, I do shoot everything in 30 FPS, as I personally like my videos a little more smoother and sharper than if I were to shoot at 25 FPS. Wait, smoother and sharper videos as my frame rate increases? Well, smoother we can understand. A video of 10 FPS looks very choppy compared to a video of 30 FPS. I mean, this one right here looks a lot smoother, but sharper? Why is that? Well, that has to do with the shutter speed, which we talked about in the previous lesson. Your frame rate and shutter speed are a little bit bound together. You see, when your camera is capturing 30 frames per second, it means that it cannot refresh the sensor more than 30 times a second. So, the lowest shutter speed that you can have is 1/30th of a second. And many cameras have that option locked. Just try it out for yourself. Set your camera to 30 frames a second and try go below 1/30th of a second. And the same thing is with 25 FPS. You can't go below 1/25th of a second. Now, some cameras do allow you to go lower, but that's some digital processing that is going on, where it'll actually going to lower the FPS without telling you. Naturally, cameras cannot do that. Now, the shutter speed actually has an even bigger correlation with the FPS. In the real world, there's also motion blur. Just wave your hand in front of your eyes. You'll see motion blur. This is obviously a natural amount of blur. When we want to recreate that natural motion blur, we take the double of the frame rate. So, shooting at 25 FPS, we set the shutter speed at 1/50th of a second. For 30 frames, that's going to be 1/60th of a second. That way, the motion blur feels natural depending on the frame rate that you choose. And that's why I said that my videos not only look smoother but also sharper when increasing that frame rate. I set my shutter speed at 1/60th of a second, less motion blur, thus my videos are sharper. And the motion still feels natural because it matches with the frame rate. And maybe that is a lot to take in, so don't worry too much about the shutter speed and your frame rate just yet. These are settings that you can take with a grain of salt. The more you get familiar with filmmaking, the more you're going to pay attention to such minor details. But let's talk real quick about slow motion. Obviously, we're going to need more frames per second, 60 FPS, maybe even 120 or perhaps 10,000 frames per second. Yes, that exists, by the way, although such cameras are super expensive. Now, having those extra frames a second means that we can stretch our video clips. We only need 30 frames, but we have 60 frames available for each second. This means that we can stretch the clip out double as long, and we're going to take 60 frames per 2 seconds. We've created slow motion. Now, if we were to do that with a normal 30 FPS clip, we would get 30 frames per 2 seconds, or 15 frames a second. Playing back that video, it starts to look choppy, a problem that we don't have with 60 FPS. So the more slow motion you want, the more frames per second you're gonna need. Most cameras already transform their captured FPS into something like 25 or 30 FPS, like my Panasonic Lumix GH5. I can record in 120 FPS, but it's going to process that into a 30 FPS clip. So when I play back the video, it's already in slow motion. I don't have to stretch the clip in video editing. So that's something to keep in mind. What frames do you capture in, and what frames is your camera processing it to? Sometimes that could be the same, recording in 60 FPS and processing it into a 60 FPS video clip, but it can also record in 120 FPS and process that into a 30 FPS file. Every camera has different options, so check that out for your camera. And that's mostly it about frame rates. Later in this class, we're going to learn more about when to shoot slow motion and how it can help us to shoot better video. But first, we need to expose our shots correctly, and that's for the next lesson.